Echoes in the Deep Brine. Chapter 3. The Coral and the Rust. The interrogation cell was a sterile white lie. Polished polymer walls, designed to be easily wiped clean of blood or despair, were slick with a persistent greasy condensation that the humming air scrubbers could never quite defeat. The ozone tang of overworked electronics mingled with the ever-present phantom of low-tide brine, a smell that had seeped into the very steel of Haven's bones. Jorin stood with his arms crossed, his reflection a distorted smear on the one-way observation glass. He had been in here for 3 hours. On the other side of the bolted-down steel table, the captive sat. He was one of the ungrounded, a scavenger scooped up from the periphery of the refinery disaster. His clothes were damp rags, his face a mask of serene indifference. His eyes were closed, and he was chanting. It wasn't a prayer, not in any language Jorin had ever catalogued. It was a low, monophonic hum, a single resonant tone that vibrated in the small room. It was maddeningly constant, a human echo of the arcology's own groaning machinery. Diagnostic profile. Subject exhibits pathological belief fixation, Category 4, Jorin said, his voice flat and loud, designed to intrude. Symptoms include auditory vocal looping and disassociation from physical stimuli, a classic case of existential contagion. The man didn't flinch. The hum continued, unwavering. Jorin felt a familiar, acidic frustration bubble in his gut. This was how it started, this quiet, unshakable certainty. This was the wall he had failed to breach before, the wall that had stood strong while his family fell behind it. He paced, the rubber soles of his boots squeaking on the damp floor. Your belief system has been designated a Stage 3 cognitive hazard. Continued resistance will result in mandatory chemical pacification and level gamma reintegration therapy. Your sense of self will be methodically dismantled and rebuilt to functional specifications. Do you understand what that means? Silence. Only the hum. A vibration in Jorin's teeth. It means we will burn out the part of your brain that finds comfort in this noise. Jorin snapped, his professionalism fraying. He slammed his hand on the table. The metallic bang was swallowed instantly by the relentless drone. The captive didn't even twitch. It was like shouting at the ocean.
Rust rot. This was useless. His tools, logic, intimidation, the entire codified lexicon of forensic theology were grains of sand against a tidal wave. He stared at the man, at the placid face and the vibrating column of air in his throat, and felt a cold dread creep over him. He was failing. Again. The faces of the dead from his last case flickered behind his eyes. He saw the tranquil smiles on their faces as they embraced oblivion. This man had that same look, even with his eyes closed. Jorin stopped pacing. He closed his own eyes for a moment, forcing himself to do the one thing he hadn't yet tried, to listen, not to the man, but to the room, to the entire system of sound. The captive's hum was the primary melody, yes, but beneath it he could feel the deep, rhythmic groan of Haven's support pylons shifting under the sea's immense pressure. He could hear the high-frequency thrum of the water purifiers in the wall, the distant shuddering clang of a reclamation workshop. It wasn't just noise. It was a chord, a dissonant, grating industrial chord that was the constant soundtrack to their lives. The locals called it metal hum madness. And this man, this man was harmonizing with it. An idea sparked in his mind. It wasn't logical. It wasn't in any directorate manual. It felt intuitive, almost artistic, a notion he would normally crush as inefficient. But his frustration had burned away his adherence to protocol. If faith was a song, you couldn't argue it into silence. You had to introduce a wrong note. He took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the damp, metallic air deep into his lungs. He focused on the captive's frequency. He listened to the city's grinding bass line. Then he opened his mouth and hummed. It wasn't a melody. It was a single, flat, ugly tone, a low, guttural vibration that was precisely half a step off from the captive's chant. It was the sound of a gear stripping, of a string snapping, of a bone breaking. It scraped against the harmony in the room like a nail dragged across polymer glass. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The captive's hum shattered into a wet, choking gasp. His eyes flew open, wide not with fear, but with sheer, unadulterated pain. He flinched back in his chair as if struck, his hands flying to his temples. The serene mask was gone, replaced by a grimace of agony. "Stop!" the man rasped, his voice raw. "Please, stop it!" Jorin held the note, his own throat aching from the strain, his eyes locked on the man's. The air in the room felt tight, pressurized. He was on to something. This wasn't a psychological trick. This was a direct, physical assault. "What song are you singing?" Jorin demanded, his voice low and intense. He let the discordant hum die in his throat. The resulting silence was more profound than any noise. The captive was trembling, his breath coming in ragged pants. He looked at Jorin, his eyes filled with a terrified clarity. "It's not a song to be sung," he whispered. "It's a lullaby, to keep it sleeping." Jorin leaned forward, his hands flat on the cold steel of the table. "Keep what sleeping?" "You don't understand," the man stammered, sweat beading on his pale forehead. "Your quarantine, the sounds your machines made at the refinery, the screaming, you broke the rhythm, you have unleashed a disharmonious song." Jorin's mind raced, connecting the impossible transmutation at the refinery with this madman's talk of melodies, the rapid cancerous growth, the body horror. It wasn't just a disease spreading, it was mutating, because he had disrupted it. He had played the wrong note. "Who?" Jorin's voice was a blade. "Who is trying to fix it? Who is the composer?" The captive shrank back, a new kind of fear in his eyes, not of Jorin, but of the name he was about to speak. "He is trying to mend the melody, to soothe the chord. But your noise is too loud now." "The name," Jorin pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Give me the name, your choir master, your patient zero." The man swallowed hard, the sound slick and loud in the quiet room. He looked at the sterile walls, at the humming lights, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Long pause. Then his eyes met Jorin's, defeated. "Caelus Rendor," he whispered. "Caelus Rendor is trying to mend the song." Jorin straightened up. Caelus Rendor. He had it. A name, a target. The anchor point for this entire mimetic plague. The frustration that had gnawed at him for hours evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, and exhilarating focus. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his mind already calculating, strategizing. He didn't look back at the broken man shivering in the chair. He had what he needed. The key. Patient zero. He rapped his knuckles twice on the door, and it hissed open, revealing the sterile corridor beyond. "Sedate him," Jorin said to the waiting guard, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Level beta. I don't want him humming again." He strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the metallic silence. He finally had a path forward, a thread to pull in this tangled mess of faith and horror, a way to prove, once and for all, that this was a disease he could cut out. He just had to find the source of the infection. He just had to find Caelus Rendor. The tactical office was a sanctuary of cold reason. Here the air didn't smell of brine and blooming fungal decay, but of ozone and the sterile metallic tang of industrial-grade recyclers. It was a lie, of course, but a necessary one. Jorin Vask stood before a wall-sized display, a glowing schematic of the bellow's labyrinthine sectors hovering in the dark. The light cast his reflection, gaunt and sharp-edged, over the glowing map. He kept his hands clasped behind his back to stop them from shaking. Coral and rust, bone and steel. The images from the refinery were burned onto the inside of his eyelids. Not just chanting sickness, not hysteria, a physical transmutation that laughed at the laws of biology. He had seen a woman's arm, the skin split open like a seed pod, revealing not muscle and sinew, but a lattice of pale, coral-like growth that had threaded itself into a coolant pipe. The pipe pulsed with a faint, rhythmic blue-green light, in time with the wheezing breaths still escaping her lungs. Impossible. It was a word his profession didn't allow, but it hammered at the inside of his skull. He had to contain it, not the plague, but the impossibility. He had to cage it in a framework he could dissect. The hiss of the office door sliding open pulled him from the memory. Brecker Hoon entered, his bulk seeming to shrink the sterile room. The corporate enforcer moved with a quiet efficiency that belied his size. His dark uniform was immaculate, but Jorin could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the room's corners. Brecker had been the one to put his augmented fist through the chest of that thing. The worker's jaw had unhinged like a serpent's. He was the one who had to clean up Jorin's failed quarantine. "Sir," Brecker's voice was a low, gravelly hum, the sound of stressed metal. "The refinery is sealed. Directorate crews are prepping for full thermal sterilization." "They'll be wasting their time," Jorin said, not turning from the map. He watched the blinking icons of Directorate squads moving into position. Clumsy, loud, spreading fear. "You can't burn an idea, Brecker." He finally turned, his face a carefully constructed mask of clinical authority. The tremors of his uncertainty were buried deep. "The neurotoxin cover story is officially defunct. What we're facing is a weaponized mimetic pathogen, a cognitive virus." He paced in front of the screen, his own reflection, a ghost walking through the digital streets of the bellows. "It transmits through sound, through patterns. The chanting, the metal hum madness the locals talk about, those are infection vectors. The pathogen doesn't just induce a psychological break, it carries a biological payload. It seems to overwrite the host's physiology with a new blueprint." It was a hypothesis, a desperate leap to connect 2 points across an abyss of raw impossibility, but he said it as if he were reading from a textbook. If he said it enough, he might even believe it himself. Brecker's expression didn't change. He was a soldier, accustomed to receiving orders, not debating theory. The chorus of the Brine, the one we captured. The distribution network, Jorin stated, gesturing to a smaller secondary screen. It showed a live feed of the holding cell next door. A lone figure, in damp skin rags, sat on a metal slab perfectly still. He hadn't moved in an hour. Their rituals, their chants, they aren't acts of worship. They're the methodology of infection. They've been cultivating this plague in the dark, refining it. Jorin tapped a command into the console. The main schematic was replaced by a grainy, low-light image of a man. He had a lean, ascetic face, sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to drink the meager light. His hair was long, matted with brine. He looked like 1,000 other ungrounded drifters. "This is our target," Jorin said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense. "Caelus Rendor. According to the captive, he is their conductor, their prophet. I believe he's our patient zero, the architect of this disease." A man. It felt good to have a man to blame, a single, tangible source, not some unknowable, physics-defying horror from the deep brine. Just a terrorist, a biohacker with a god complex. Jorin could understand a man. He could hunt a man. He spoke of a disharmonious song, Jorin continued, preempting Brecker's question. He claimed my quarantine, my methods, were making the sickness worse. It's classic misdirection, doctrinaire nonsense meant to disguise their technical framework. Song is their term for the mimetic carrier wave. Harmony is its resonant frequency. He wasn't warning me. He was boasting. The lie tasted like rust in his mouth, but it was a necessary tool. He had to be certain, and he had to make Brecker certain too. Doubt was a luxury Haven could no longer afford. "What are your orders, sir?" Brecker asked. His gaze was fixed on the image of Caelus Rendor. Jorin took a deep breath, the cold, recycled air doing nothing to calm the frantic energy coiling in his gut. "The Directorate's formal response will be a citywide increase in mental hygiene monitoring, purge squads in the bellows. It will be a bloodbath. It will fail. Panic and despair are the ideal culture medium for this thing to breed in, a blunt instrument for a surgical problem." He turned to face Brecker fully, their eyes meeting. "I need to cut the head off the snake. The official channels are compromised by denial and incompetence. Otho Valerius still thinks this is a problem he can solve with memos and pacification drugs." Jorin leaned closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I am going after Rendor. I'm going into the bellows to find him. I need an escort who knows the territory and can handle himself when things go sideways. I need you." He let the words hang in the silent, humming air. It was a direct contravention of protocol. He was asking this man to defy the very corporate structure he served. Brecker was silent for a long moment. His gaze flickered from Jorin to the one-way glass of the holding cell, then back. He had seen what was in the refinery. He knew the official response was a placebo for a cancer. "Rules of engagement?" he asked finally.
Relief, cold and sharp, cut through Jorin. He had his weapon. "Rendor is to be taken alive. He's the source code. I need to know how to write an antivirus. Anyone else, anyone who shows signs of advanced infection, is a terminal case. You will act to preserve the mission. Is that understood?" The memory of the unhinged jaw and the high-frequency shriek, Brecker's augmented fist punching through corrupted flesh, that was the reality now, not psychology, pest control. Understood. Brecker said, the words clean and final as a closing airlock. Good. Jorin straightened up, his renewed purpose settling over him like armor. The uncertainty was gone, hammered into the shape of a mission. Get your kit. We move in 30 minutes, before the directorate locks down the district and makes our job impossible. Brecker nodded once and exited without another word. Jorin turned back to the glowing map of the bellows. It was no longer a schematic. It was a hunting ground. And deep within its corroded, dripping heart, his enemy was waiting. A man. It had to be just a man. The transition from the sterile silence of the Arium transport to the bellows thoroughfare was not a change in location, it was a phase shift in reality. The air hit Jorin first. It wasn't just humid, it was an aerosolized broth of ozone from shorting circuitry, the coppery tang of recycled oxygen, and something older, deeper. The smell of wet rust and fungal spores, the low-tide exhalation of the drowned world below. He felt the moisture instantly, a clammy film settling on his skin, clinging to the pristine gray fabric of the directorate tunic. He resisted the urge to wipe his face, an act that would be a concession, a surrender to the oppressive environment. Beside him, Brecker moved with an entirely different physics. The enforcer, a head taller than most and twice as broad, didn't shove through the throng of dampskins. He was like a great smooth river stone, the current of humanity simply parted around him, a mixture of ingrained deference and the pragmatic desire not to collide with a man whose left arm was a gleaming, articulated lattice of hydrocorpus chrome and steel. His footing was sure on the slick, great metal catwalks that served as streets. Jorin, by contrast, felt his regulation boots threatening to slide with every careful step. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnervingly loud in his ears, a counterpoint to the symphony of decay around him.
"Keep your footing, sir," Brecker said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise without any effort. It wasn't the polite, ubiquitous greeting of the arcology. It was a genuine, practical instruction. Jorin gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning, cataloging, pathologizing. This was his defense mechanism. The chaos of the bellows was just data. A woman with a persistent rattling cough hawked nutrient paste from a stall lit by the sickly green glow of cultivated phosphorescent fungi. Terminal lung rot, likely accelerated by spore inhalation. Despair metric, 7.410. Productive function, minimal. A knot of teenagers with dilated pupils and twitching hands huddled near a sparking junction box, their whispers lost in the cacophony. Black market stimulants, a common coping mechanism for chronic fatigue and existential dread, prone to deviancy. He saw it all as a system, a diseased organism whose symptoms he was uniquely qualified to diagnose. But the certainty felt brittle now, a thin crust over a void of doubt gouged out by the impossible biotransmutation he'd witnessed back at the refinery. And underneath all the noise, the hiss of makeshift grills, the chatter of 100 conversations, the distant clang of a reclamation workshop, was the hum, the metal hum. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical presence, a low-frequency vibration that traveled up through the soles of his boots and settled in his jawbone. It made the fillings in his teeth ache. In the Arium, it was a distant, theoretical thrum, dampened and insulated. Here, it was the world's pulse, a constant, oppressive pressure that felt like it was trying to get inside his skull. For a moment, Jorin thought he heard a voice woven into the fabric of the drone, a long, mournful vowel sound, like a choir singing a single note miles away. He stopped, tilting his head. The faces in the crowd became a blur of pale skin and shadowed eyes. The fungal light seemed to pulse in time with the hum.
Sir? Brecker had stopped a few paces ahead, his posture unchanged, but his attention now fixed entirely on Jorin. Jorin blinked, the illusion, the auditory hallucination, shattering. It was just the machinery, just metal hum madness, a documented phenomenon of sensory deprivation and environmental stress. A textbook case. He had written a monograph on it. Nothing, he said, his voice tighter than he intended. Resonant frequency artifact.
Brecker's expression was unreadable, but his organic eye lingered on Jorin for a second too long. Happens, he grunted, turning to resume his path. The bellows breathes. Sometimes it gets in your head. The phrase stuck in Jorin's mind. The bellows breathes. It was an anthropomorphism, a primitive belief assigning agency to a machine. And yet, it felt terrifyingly accurate. The air being pumped through grimy vents, the condensation dripping from overhead pipes like saliva, the deep groan of stressed pylons like a body settling. It was all part of one vast, miserable organism. His uniform felt like a target. The simple, sharp lines of directorate authority were an accusation in this place of chaotic survival. Dampskins averted their eyes as he passed, their faces shutting down into masks of weary neutrality. He was the mental hygiene man, the one who quantified their despair and prescribed chemical pacification. He was the system flaw made manifest. The thought brought him a familiar flicker of cold satisfaction, but it was weak, diluted by the sheer, overwhelming reality of the place. He was an antibody, yes, but he felt like he was floating in an ocean of infection. They passed a stall where a vendor was selling scavenged pre-cascade trinkets, faded plastic toys, corroded data drives, a child's shoe. Jorin's gaze snagged on a small, tarnished silver locket. For a horrifying second, he saw another one just like it, clutched in a pale hand, half submerged in water the color of rust. His family. The memory was a physical blow, a phantom limb aching with a pain that never faded. He forced his eyes away, his jaw clenched so tight it sent a spike of pain into his temple. This is why, he thought, the words a silent, desperate mantra. This is why belief must be excised. It promises meaning where there is only mechanics. It offers solace that ends in self-destruction. The thought was his shield, his scalpel. But the hum was still there, a constant vibration against that shield, testing its integrity. The noodle bars just past this junction, Brecker said, gesturing with his chin toward a narrow, dripping alleyway from which steam and the smell of boiling algae escaped. The broker calls herself Gisla.
Gisla Rask, Jorin clarified, pulling the name from the encrypted file he'd received. An ungrounded data slinger with a sealed juvenile record and a long list of black market information trades. An unreliable variable, a necessary one. That's the one, Brecker confirmed. She has a reputation, finds things that don't want to be found, for a price. Everyone has a price, Jorin stated. It was one of the core tenets of his rational world. Brecker almost smiled. It was a grim, unsettling sight. Down here, sir, you'd be surprised. Some people would rather have a truth that kills them than a lie that keeps them working. The statement was uncomfortably close to the core of the problem. Jorin didn't reply. They reached the mouth of the alley. The steam was thick, smelling of salt and something vaguely savory. The neon sign above the doorway flickered erratically, the characters for 8 luck noodles half extinguished. It looked less like a restaurant and more like a wound in the side of the container wall. Brecker paused, placing his human hand lightly on Jorin's shoulder, a surprisingly grounding gesture. Word of advice, whatever she offers you, don't drink the tea. It's not tea. With that, he stepped into the steam, a dark shape swallowed by the grime. Jorin took a final look back at the chaotic thoroughfare, at the sea of faces washed in the lurid glow of fungal lamps. He could still feel the hum, a physical thing, a living vibration in the air. He felt a profound, chilling sense of immersion, as if he'd just taken a breath and found his lungs were filling with water. He squared his shoulders, a pointless gesture of order against the tide, and followed Brecker into the darkness. The defunct hydro-pumping station didn't groan like the rest of Haven. It held its breath. The perpetual metallic sigh of the arcology's stressed pylons was absent here, replaced by a profound, tomb-like silence that felt heavier than the water pressure outside. Gishla's intel had been precise. Level Gamma 9, Sector Kilo. Kalis Rendor's last known access point. His nest. Brecker pushed the corroded blast door, its hinges protesting with a single sharp shriek before surrendering. The air that rolled out was cold and carried the scent of wet stone and something else. A clean, sharp smell like bone bleach overlying the familiar damp rot. "Keep your footing," Brecker grunted, his augmented hand resting near the pistol holstered on his thigh. His shoulder lamp cut a clean white cone through the oppressive dark. I stepped past him, my own light tracing the cavernous space. This was one of the hearts that had failed. Titanic pumps, big as barges, sat inert, their iron hides coated in a slick of moisture and patches of sickly green bioluminescent moss. Catwalks laced the upper darkness like skeletal fingers. The only sound was the maddeningly rhythmic drip of condensation from a high pipe, each drop landing in a deep puddle with a hollow pluck that echoed through the chamber. Pluck. Pluck. A water clock counting down to nothing. No power, no heat, no hostiles. Brecker's voice was a low rumble beside me. "Place has been dead for a decade." "Not entirely," I murmured. My beam had found it. The first one. I walked toward a massive valve wheel, my boots scuffing on the grated floor. It wasn't the valve that held my attention. It was what was wrapped around it. Intricate, complex lattices of salvaged copper wire and what looked like fiber-optic filaments were woven around the rusted iron spokes. But it wasn't just wire. Woven into the geometric patterns, secured with almost surgical precision, were dozens of small, clean, white bones. Fish vertebrae, most likely, but some were longer, needle-thin. They formed spirals and fractal shapes, catching the light like polished ivory. It wasn't a decoration. It was an equation made physical. "Rust rot," Brecker breathed, coming to stand beside me. "What is all this?" I didn't answer. I swept my light across the chamber. They were everywhere. Adorning railings, wrapped around pipes, hanging from the catwalks like morbid wind chimes. Each one was different, yet each followed the same alien geometry. This wasn't the work of a frenzied mind, a symptom of the chanting sickness. The workers at the refinery had been spastic, their carvings raw and visceral. This was deliberate. This was the patient work of a mathematician or a watchmaker, a weaver. My entire pathology profile of Kalis Rendor felt thin, pathetic. Delusional messiah complex, schizotypal manifestations, ritualistic behavior. The labels were a comfort, a way to box up the horror and file it away. But they didn't account for this cold, obsessive precision. This was not madness. It was a different kind of logic entirely. "He's building something," I said, more to myself than Brecker. "Looks like trash to me," Brecker said, his light panning for threats, not clues. "Some kind of ungrounded ritual to ward off the metal hum, maybe? Let's find the terminal Gisla mentioned." We moved deeper, our lights dancing across the silent machinery. I felt a growing sense of frustration. I'd come here expecting a lair, a place of frantic creation where I could find the biological or chemical agents Kalis was using to engineer this plague. I needed samples. I needed data. I needed a patient to dissect. Instead, I found an art gallery, and it was making my teeth ache. On the far side of the chamber, tucked beneath a skeletal gantry crane, was a small maintenance nook, and in it, a single workbench with a functioning terminal. Its screen was dark, but a tiny blue LED on the console blinked with a steady living pulse. The clean ozonic smell was stronger here. "Got a power source," Brecker noted, his voice tight. He scanned the shadows around us, his posture tense. "Could be rigged." I approached the workbench slowly. Unlike everything else in the station, it was immaculate. No dust, no rust, no film of moisture. The surface was wiped clean. A portable fusion battery pack, a Hydrocorpus standard issue, was neatly plugged into the terminal. The air hummed with its quiet power. This was a place of work, recently abandoned. The anticipation prickled my skin again. He was here. He must have just left. I ran a gloved hand over the keyboard, then activated the screen. It flickered to life, showing a bare, standard Directorate OS login prompt. No files on the desktop. No hidden directories in the root. I ran a quick diagnostic for recent activity. The logs were wiped. Professionally wiped, not just deleted. Scrubbed clean with a military-grade eraser program. A dead end. "Anything?" Brecker asked, his patience fraying.
Nothing. He's meticulous. I leaned closer, my mind racing. Why leave the power on? Why wipe the terminal, but leave the whole setup here? It was a contradiction. A statement. It felt like a taunt. My eyes scanned the console, the connections, the power conduits, and then I saw it. It was sitting beside the terminal, not in it, a single microspec data chip. Its casing was a flat, non-reflective black, and a tiny red light on its edge blinked once every few seconds, out of sync with the terminal's blue pulse. It was so small, so deliberately placed, it couldn't have been forgotten. It was left. I stared at it. A breadcrumb, a key, or a poison pill. This was the central conflict of my profession made manifest. Faith systems operate on lures, the promise of hidden knowledge, of a truth just beyond the veil, offered to the desperate. You follow the first breadcrumb, and it leads to another, and another, until you've walked so far into the dark you can't remember the way back. It's how they trap you. And here was Kalis, or whoever he was, leaving me a perfect, irresistible lure. "Jorin?" I picked up the chip, holding it between my thumb and forefinger. It was cool to the touch. The rational part of my brain, the part that still held sway, screamed at me. It's a trap, a logic bomb, a virus that will crash my datapad and infect any network I connect to. It's the digital equivalent of a needle full of his plague. But the other part of me,
The part that had seen a man's jaw unhinge and his spine fuse with a steel pipe, knew that my rules no longer applied. I was off the map. This chip was the only landmark in sight. "He left this for us," I said, my voice flat. Brecker took a step closer, peering at the tiny object in my hand. "You sure he didn't just drop it?" "Look around, Brecker," I said, gesturing to the intricate web-like sculptures of wire and bone. "Does this look like the work of a man who just drops things?" No. This was deliberate. I pocketed the chip. The frustration I'd felt moments before was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged certainty. I was no longer an investigator observing a phenomenon. I was a participant in a dialogue. Kalis had just spoken. Now it was my turn to answer. "So what's the play?" Brecker asked, his gaze still sweeping the dark corners of the station. "We take this to the directorate? Let the tech division crack?"
I thought of Otho Valerius. I thought of the official neurotoxin lie. I thought of the look on Gaisler's face, the utter contempt for the system I represented. If I handed this over, it would disappear into a black box analysis, and I'd be given another sanitized, useless report. I'd be a cog again, turning in a machine that was failing. "No," I said, turning away from the glowing terminal. "The directorate has lost containment. We're on our own now." I looked back at Brecker, meeting his gaze in the gloom. "Gaisler cracked their encryption to find this place. She can crack this." Brecker was silent for a long moment, the only sound that damnable dripping. Pluck, pluck. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Jorin. We do it your way." He looked around the weaver's nest one last time, a flicker of deep unease in his eyes. "But I don't like this. I feel like we're a couple of flies who just accepted an invitation from a spider." The defunct hydro-pumping station was a metal gut, groaning with indigestion. Water, thick with an algae sheen, wept from every rivet and joint in the vaulted ceiling, collecting in rust-colored puddles on the grated floor. The air, heavy and wet, tasted of ozone and deep decay. Jorin sat on a cold, corroded maintenance locker, his back to the massive, silent impeller of Pump 3. Its silence was a heavier presence than the constant hum of the bellows. It was the sound of failure. On his lap, his directorate-issued datapad flickered, its crisp white light a sterile island in the sickly green gloom cast by phosphorescent fungi clinging to the walls. He had the chip, the tiny sliver of forbidden data Gaisler had pressed into his hand, slotted into the pad's diagnostic port. For the past hour, he'd run every decryption protocol in the directorate's arsenal. He tried brute force algorithms that taxed the pad's processor, making its casing warm against his thighs. He'd tried backdoor exploits, known only to forensic theologians, tools designed to crack the primitive encryption of nascent cults. Nothing. Each attempt ended the same way, a single, infuriating line of crimson text. "Error. Protocol unrecognized. Data is non-standard."
"Rust rot," Jorin muttered, the words swallowed by a sudden percussive drip of water nearby. Non-standard. Of course it was non-standard. It was from the black market. It was from the ungrounded. It was a piece of the city's chaotic, irrational underbelly, and his tools, the tools of order, of the directorate, of reason, were useless against it. It was a perfect, maddening metaphor for his entire investigation. He ran the diagnostic again, a desperate, futile repetition of a failed experiment. The progress bar filled, hesitated, and then the red text blinked back into existence. He felt a spike of cold fury, a familiar frustration that had gnawed at him for years. The universe was supposed to operate on knowable principles. Data was supposed to be quantifiable. This was anarchy in silicon form. From the shadows near the station's entrance, a low voice rumbled. "It's not going to work, sir." Jorin looked up, his eyes taking a moment to adjust from the screen's glare. Brecker Hune stood there, a mountain of augmented muscle and quiet observation. He hadn't moved in an hour, a living statue whose stillness was more unnerving than any threat. His corporate enforcer armor was scuffed and battered, its polished hydrocorpus insignias catching the faint fungal glow. He held his helmet under one arm, his expression unreadable. "Your optimism is noted, Enforcer," Jorin said, the sarcasm a thin shield. He wiped a smear of condensation from the datapad screen. "It isn't about optimism," Brecker replied, his voice even. He took a step forward, the grate groaning under his weight. "I've seen tech like that before, in reclamation busts down in the lower maze. That's not directorate encryption. It's not even standard corporate. That's ungrounded work. They build their protocols from salvaged pre-cascade fragments, stitch them together with their own code. It's a mess, a lock made of spare parts that only a key made of the same junk can open." Jorin stared at the chip, then back at Brecker. The man was a thug, a corporate hammer. But he was a hammer that knew the grain of the wood he was hitting. Jorin's entire career had been spent in the sterile labs and administrative towers of the Arium. He studied the pathologies of the bellows from a distance, like a biologist examining microbes under glass. Brecker had lived in the petri dish. "And your point is?" Jorin asked, though he already knew the answer. He could feel the cold dread of it coiling in his gut. "My point, sir," Brecker said, his tone careful, "is that you can't open that lock with your keys. You need a thief." Jorin's spine went rigid. "Absolutely not." "A data broker," Brecker corrected, though it changed nothing. "Someone ungrounded. Someone who lives in that world of junk code. They'll have the software, or they'll know how to build it, for a price." "No," the word was sharp, final. "I will not compromise the integrity of a directorate investigation by contracting a criminal element. These brokers," he spat the word, "are information parasites. They thrive on the instability the directorate works to contain. Paying one for services is tantamount to funding the very system flaw we are trying to correct. It's a violation of mental hygiene protocols, a security breach, and an ideological contamination." He was quoting directly from his training manuals. The words were a catechism, a shield of righteous procedure he had held up his entire life. They had failed to protect his family. They had failed to stop the horrors in the refinery. And now they felt flimsy and hollow in his own mouth. Brecker listened patiently, his head tilted slightly. When Jorin finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence, filled only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water and the distant, mournful groan of Haven's metal skeleton. "All right," Brecker said, his voice dropping lower. "Then what's the alternative? You go back to Valerius, you hand him a chip you can't open, and tell him you got it from an unregistered source after abandoning a compromised quarantine? You think he's going to help you?" Jorin had no reply. Valerius would bury him. He would be reassigned to analyzing agricultural output reports for the rest of his career. The truth about the refinery, about the coral-fused bodies and the impossible biology, would be erased, classified, forgotten. and the thing responsible for it would continue to fester in the dark. We need to find Kalis Rendor. He's the objective.
He's a ghost, Brecker countered flatly. No official record, no address. The chorus doesn't have a public headquarters. This chip, he gestured with his chin towards the datapad, is the only lead we have. It's the only thing in this whole rusted mess that's real. The woman who gave it to you, she knew what she was doing. She knew you couldn't open it. This is part of her price. She's forcing your hand. Jorin closed his eyes. The image flooded his mind unbidden. The worker, his subordinate, pinned to the wall, not by metal, but by his own bones, which had erupted from his back in branching coral-like spurs that had then fused seamlessly into the refinery's plumbing. The man's face, a mask of placid horror, glowing with the same sickly blue-green light as the growths. The high-frequency shriek from a jaw that had unhinged like a serpent's. That was real. That was not a cognitive virus. That was a biological apocalypse in miniature. And the rules, his precious rational rules, hadn't stopped it. They had only documented it. His ideology was a retaining wall, and a tidal wave was building on the other side. He opened his eyes and looked at the datapad. The red text seemed to mock him. Protocol unrecognized. My entire world is a protocol I no longer recognize. The thought was a blasphemy. It was despair. It was a breach of hygiene. And it was the truth. He took a slow, measured breath, the damp air feeling heavy in his lungs, like he was breathing water. The choice wasn't between order and chaos anymore. It was between impotence and a chance, between ideological purity and a single, dirty lead that might take him to the heart of the disease. "Fine," Jorin said. The word was brittle, a shard of glass. He stood up, his joints protesting the cold. He felt a decade older than he had that morning. "Find one." Brecker nodded, the movement minimal. "Any preference? Some are cleaner than others. Some will sell the data twice." "Find one who is discreet," Jorin commanded, his voice regaining a sliver of his usual authority. "And hungry. I want them to need the kilocows more than they need to gossip. No known chorus sympathizers. Run a preliminary background check through whatever back channels you use. I want a full risk assessment before we make contact."
He was already rationalizing, proceduralizing his own transgression, building a new compromise system to replace the one that had just shattered. Brecker just watched him, his gaze steady. "Yes, sir," Brecker said. "I know a place. We can get a line on someone." Jorin slid the chip from his datapad and held it between his thumb and forefinger. It felt heavier now, weighted with the decision it had forced. He was stepping off the map, leaving the clean, well-lit corridors of the Directorate for the dripping, treacherous dark of the ungrounded. He was going off book, and in Haven, going off book was the first step to becoming ungrounded yourself. The noodle bar and its phantom warmth were 3 lefts, 2 descents, and a crawl through a corroded maintenance duct to go. Now there was only the cold, wet dark of the bellows' unlit capillaries. Brecker moved through the maze with the grim confidence of a man returning to a familiar hell. His heavy, augmented tread was a solid, reassuring metronome against the cacophony of dripping water and the deep, abyssal groans of Haven's stressed pylons. I followed, my own footsteps tentative on the slick, algae-furred catwalk. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every drip of condensation down my collar felt like a prelude to a blade. My mind, a place I once considered an ordered library of rational thought,
was now a ransacked archive. Images of the refinery, of coral-spiked flesh woven into rusted gantries, of a glowing, pulsating shrine made of men I had locked in a cage, played on a nauseating loop. The doctrines of psychopathology, the cognitive models of belief I had built my life upon, were useless ash. This wasn't a contagious idea. It was a contagious reality. "Here," Brecker grunted, his voice a low rumble. He stopped short, his bulk filling the narrow passage. Ahead was not a door, but a seamless slab of rust-pitted steel, bolted directly onto the concrete wall of a massive support pillar. There were no handles, no visible hinges, only a single, dark camera lens like the unblinking eye of a spider, and a small, grime-caked speaker grill. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something acrid and metallic, like burnt wire.
Brecker rapped his knuckles against the steel. Not the knuckles of his flesh and blood hand, but the carbon polymer ones of his augmented arm. The sound was a sharp, piercing report that cut through the ambient drip and hum. We waited. The only response was the deep thrum of the arcology itself, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. Brecker knocked again, a precise 3-tap rhythm. "Gisla, it's Hune. I'm calling in a marker." Silence. My own breathing sounded ragged in my ears. I was a forensic theologian of the Directorate, a man whose presence commanded access and compliance. Here, I was just baggage, a dry feet drowning in the damp, utterly dependent on a corporate thug and the goodwill of some ungrounded data runner. A crackle of static broke the quiet, and a voice, tinny and filtered, leaked from the grill. "The last time you called in a marker, Hune, you left 3 mercs and a ruptured coolant line in your wake. My server fans were filtering out synth flesh particulates for a week." "They drew first," Brecker said flatly. "This is different, clean." The voice shifted its focus. "Define clean. My scans show a hydrocorpus enforcer and a dry feet with a Directorate signature all over him. He smells like the Arium, like recycled air and self-satisfaction. That's the opposite of clean, Hune. That's a liability." My jaw tightened. She was scanning us, watching us, dissecting us from the sterile safety of her fortress. "He's a client," Brecker stated, not a hint of pleading in his tone. "He's paying. The Directorate doesn't pay for information they can't torture out of someone. And Hydrocorpus doesn't hire outsiders when they can just send you to break down the door. So try again. Why are you bringing the system to my threshold?" This was my opening. I stepped forward, trying to project an authority I no longer felt. "Gisla Rask, I am forensic theologian Jorin Vosk. I'm not here on behalf of the Directorate. I'm here because I am pursuing a line of inquiry my superiors have deemed irrelevant." I chose the words carefully. "I need the data you offered, the real cause. I'm prepared to transfer a substantial amount of kilocals for it." The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. The dark lens of the camera seemed to zoom, to focus on my face. I felt like a microbe under a microscope. "Substantial is a subjective term, theologian, and your kind trades in beliefs, not currency. Your money is worthless if you bring a world of trouble with it. Stand still, both of you, arms out to the sides." Brecker complied without hesitation. I followed suit, my coat hanging awkwardly.
A thin, horizontal slit opened above the speaker grill with a hiss of pneumatics. A beam of piercing blue light emerged, crawling down my body from head to toe, then repeating the process on Brecker. The light was cold, invasive. It hummed with a low frequency that made the fillings in my teeth ache. I could feel it mapping my biometrics, searching for transmitters, for hidden weapons, for the subtle energy signature of a directorate-issued tracker. I was being treated like a symptom, a potential infection to be sterilized before it could breach the sterile field. The irony was a bitter pill. "No subdermal trackers," the voice announced, a hint of surprise in its filtered tone. "No active comms besides your enforcer's encrypted link, which is currently offline. No directorate-issue weapons. You really are off the leash." "I told you," Brecker said. "Clean." "You're clean of bugs. I haven't decided if you're clean of intent." Another pause. I could imagine her on the other side, watching feeds, weighing variables, running risk analyses. She wasn't just a broker. She was a system administrator for her own survival. "Your message," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "You said this wasn't a disease. You said it was an upgrade. That implies you know what it is. That's the data I'm buying." The blue light vanished, and the slit hissed shut. "The price is not just kilocals, Theologian. The price is that you listen, and when you leave here, you do not bring what you learn back to your masters in the Arium. You use it, personally. Is that understood?" "Understood," I said, without hesitation. For a moment I thought she would refuse. The silence returned, deeper this time. Then a heavy clank echoed from within the steel slab, followed by another and another. A sequence of deadbolts, at least 4 of them, were being retracted by powerful servomotors. A final loud hiss of depressurization, and the entire slab of steel receded a few inches into the wall, before sliding sideways with a low groan of metal on metal. The air that washed over us was a shock. It was dry, clean. It smelled of hot electronics, ionized air from electrostatic filters, and the faint dusty scent of aging polymer. The contrast with the damp fungal breath of the bellows was staggering. Beyond the threshold was a small cube-shaped chamber, clad entirely in gray sound-dampening foam. Another identical steel door sat on the far side, an airlock. Brecker stepped in. I followed, and the outer door groaned shut behind us, plunging us into temporary darkness, before sterile white LED strips flickered to life. The airlock was small, claustrophobic. We stood there as a low hum vibrated through the floor, likely another, more intensive scanner. Finally, the inner door slid open. The space beyond was a cavern of ordered chaos. Racks of humming servers lined one wall, their blinking status lights reflecting off tangled rivers of fiber-optic cable that ran across the ceiling like luminous vines. Multiple monitors were mounted on a central console, some displaying scrolling code, others showing security feeds of the alley we had just left. It was a data haven, a digital hermit's cave carved into the decaying heart of the city. And there, sitting at the console, was Gisla Rosk. She wasn't looking at us. Her attention was on a monitor displaying a complex waveform analysis. She was small, wiry, dressed in a practical gray jumpsuit. A mass of dark hair was tied back in a messy knot. As she finally turned her head, the light caught her face. One eye was dark and human. The other was a piece of intricate pre-cascade cybernetics, a brass-rimmed lens that whirred almost silently as it focused on me.
There was no warmth in her gaze, only the cool, detached curiosity of a researcher examining a new and unpredictable specimen. She gestured vaguely at two worn polymer-crete stools. The noodle bar had been a lie, a public stage for a transaction too dirty for open air. The real meeting was here, in what Gisela called her data haven. It was a repurposed electrical conduit junction, a tumor of salvaged tech and stolen power bulging from the guts of a bellows support pylon. The air was a cocktail of hot ozone, the sharp metallic tang of failing capacitors, and the ever-present cloying scent of damp rust and fungus. A dozen mismatched monitors cast a flickering, spectral light across her face, their glow reflecting in the complex, whirring lens of her cybernetic left eye. Jorin's own reflection was a ghost in the dark screens, his face pale and drawn. He could still feel the phantom vibration of Brecker's augmented arm punching through that thing, that former worker. The memory was a shard of ice in his gut. The image of coral-like bone bursting from skin, of a human form fusing with rusted steel, had overwritten 72 years of structured, rational reality. He was a forensic theologian. He diagnosed belief. He didn't perform autopsies on miracles. He laid the data chip on the scarred polymer workbench between them. It was a standard directorate evidence wafer, small and black. In this nest of tangled wires and jury-rigged hardware, it looked like a shard of obsidian on a forest floor. "This is it," Jorin said, his voice flat. "It's a site log pull from the primary processing floor, Refinery 7. Gisela didn't look at him. Her attention, and the silent whirring of her optic, was fixed on the chip. She picked it up not with her fingers, but with a pair of magnetic tweezers, holding it to the light of a monitor displaying cascading lines of green code. The lens in her eye clicked, adjusting its focus, with a sound like a tiny, precise insect. "Directorate issue," she murmured, her voice a low rasp. "Standard encryption for field reports. Trivial." She made a move to slot it into a reader cobbled together from 3 different generations of tech. But then she stopped. Her organic eye narrowed, joining her cybernetic one in intense scrutiny. "Wait." Medium pause. "The shell is directorate, but the core protocol, the root lock." Jorin felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "What about it?" She funnily looked up at him, the mismatched eyes giving her an unnervingly asymmetrical expression. The cybernetic one glowed with a faint blue light. The human one was dark with suspicion. "This is Hydrocorpus Lock and Key. Old. Cascade era. The kind they used to bury geological surveys that found inconvenient bedrock faults. The kind they used to erase the existence of entire research teams." She placed the chip back on the desk with a definitive click. "This isn't a report on a neurotoxin leak, theologian. This is a tombstone." Jorin's throat was dry. He had known, of course. He'd seen the impossibility with his own eyes. But to hear it confirmed by this ungrounded data scavenger made the breach of his own reality official. "Can you open it?" "Can I open it?" She let out a short, sharp huff of air that wasn't quite a laugh. "I can crack open the directorate's weekly pacification schedule and tell you which brand of chemical bliss they're pumping into the Arium's air supply. Yes, I can open your little black box. The question is, why should I?" Here it was, the transaction. He'd prepared for this. "My account has over 80,000 kilocals. It's yours." Gisela smiled, a thin, cynical twisting of her lips. $80,000. Wow, I could almost afford real protein for a month. She leaned forward, the glow of the monitors carving deep shadows into her face. I don't want your kilocals, Jorin Vask. They're worthless down here. Currency is a superstition for people who still believe the system works. Then what? Jorin asked, his patience fraying. The hum of her server racks felt like it was vibrating in his teeth. Black market antidepressants, unsanctioned data from the old world, name it. I want something you have, she said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. The whirring of her eye sped up slightly. The directorate keeps files, redacted files, and behind them, unredacted raw data archives. I want the full unredacted incident file on Refinery 7. Everything. Not just the doctored report you're showing your superiors. I want the raw biometrics from the workers for the last 6 months. I want the maintenance logs for the machinery they fused with. I want the audio logs, the security footage, every kilobyte of unanalyzed, uncompressed data.
Jorin felt his blood run cold. It was an impossible request. Giving an ungrounded, a classified directorate file was not just a career-ending move, it was treason. It was the kind of breach that got people scrubbed from the system, their existence reduced to a data anomaly. "I can't do that," he said, the words feeling heavy and stupid in his mouth. "You can," she countered instantly. "Your clearance is level 4. Forensic theology has deep access privileges. You're authorized to pull raw psyche eval and biometric data for contagion analysis. You just have to do it. That data is classified for a reason. It's a matter of arcology security." He was reciting protocol, the words of the man he had been this morning. They tasted like ash. "Arcology security?" she hissed, the word a curse. She gestured wildly at the weeping, rust-stained walls of her haven. "Look around you. The security is that the people in the bellows live and die in the damp without asking too many questions. That's all it's ever been." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I don't care about your chanting sickness, Vask. Not really. But the protocols they use to hide this is the same digital fingerprint I've been hunting for years. The same encryption, the same data burial techniques." Her human eye was filled with a desperate, burning light. 17 years ago, my parents were on a hydrocorpus survey team in the lower foundations. Geologists. They were reported lost in a structural collapse. Their files were sealed with this exact encryption, an encryption that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The pieces clicked into place in Jorin's mind. This wasn't about kilocals or leverage. It was a ghost story, a personal obsession. She wasn't just a data broker, she was a hunter. "You think the file on the refinery will have a link to your parents' disappearance?" "I think a system only has so many ways to lie," she shot back. "And when it lies big, it uses the same templates. The routing logs for this data suppression, the server addresses where the raw files are sent for deep archival, if I can trace them for this incident, I can trace them for the old one. I can find where they buried the truth." She pointed a trembling finger at the chip on the table. "Your answers are in there. Mine are in your directorate files. A trade. The truth for the truth."
A standoff. The air thickened, heavy with the hum of illicit power and the weight of his decision. He thought of the directorate, of Otho Valerius's cold, confident face. He thought of the rules, the structures, the entire system of rational control he had dedicated his life to upholding. And then he saw it again, the pulsing, bioluminescent shrine of flesh and metal, the unhinged jaw, the coral-like growths. That was the new reality. The rules no longer applied. His own faith in logic, in systems, in pathology, had been proven insufficient. All he had left was a desperate, gnawing need to understand the heresy that had so violently disproven his religion of reason. He slowly reached for his personal data slate, the directorate-issued device feeling alien in his hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he keyed in his access code. He looked at Gisela, whose mismatched eyes were watching his every move. "Give me an isolated terminal," Jorin said, his voice a strained whisper. "The transfer will be flagged. We'll have one chance before my access is frozen." Gisela's expression didn't soften into relief. It hardened into something colder, sharper, a grim alliance forged in shared desperation. She nodded once, gesturing to a terminal in the darkest corner of the room. "Good," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Now we're both traitors. It's cleaner that way." Jorin's thumb jabbed the disconnect icon, silencing the tinny, bureaucratic drone of his superior. The abrupt quiet in Gisela Rask's data haven was heavier than the noise. It settled in the cramped space, thick with the smell of ozone from overworked processors, and a sweetish, fungal decay seeping in from the bellows beyond the reinforced door. A single bare LED on the ceiling sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the hanging bundles of fiber-optic cable look like sleeping viscera. "So," Gisela's voice cut through the stillness. It was laced with the dry amusement of someone who had just won a bet with herself. "Did he promote you for finding patient zero? Or just remind you of the Directorate's official stance on unsubstantiated field theories?"
She sat perched on a stack of server casings, her posture casual, but her gaze sharp. The faint, blue light of her cybernetic eye cycled as she studied him, a predatory gleam in its lens. Jorin refused to look at her. He stared at his own reflection in the dark screen of his datapad, a pale, drawn face he barely recognized. "The conversation was confidential," he said, his voice clipped and precise, an old habit of authority he could feel slipping. His report to Otho had been a masterpiece of omission. He'd mentioned Kalis Rendor, painting him as the cult's architect, the logical source of the mimetic contagion. He'd left out the data drive Gisela had given him, the one that felt like a lead weight in his pocket, whispering of a 70-year-old corporate conspiracy. Brecker Hoon shifted by the doorway, the sheer bulk of him a silent promise of violence. His augmented arm, polished chrome and hydraulic pistons, caught the flickering light. "Theologian. She's not Directorate. Her price was the information. She has it. We should go." "Go where?" Gisela countered, leaning forward. A loose strand of dark hair fell across her face. "Back to your sterile lab to write another report about mass hysteria. The one where you conveniently forget the part where people are melting into machinery." "I am formulating a strategy based on new intelligence," Jorin retorted, the words tasting like ash. His entire methodology, his life's work, was built on the premise that belief was a pathogen of the mind. You track the index case, you isolate, you deprogram. But the shrine in the refinery, that wasn't psychology. That was a violation of biology, of physics itself. His new intelligence was that his entire model was wrong. "You're running from the truth, Jorin Vosk," Gisela said, her voice dropping, losing its sarcastic edge and taking on a conspiratorial softness. You think Kalis Rendor created this. He's just a symptom. Like the shriekers, like the chanting, like the choral. Before Jorin could process the accusation, his datapad screamed. It wasn't a calm chime. It was a piercing, multi-tone klaxon reserved for catastrophic system failures or Level 1 bio-breaches. He flinched, the sound scraping directly against his nerves. On the screen, a crimson banner pulsed with nauseating urgency. High-priority medical alert. Quarantine Ward A. Tag, anomalous biological event.
Anomalous. Gisela was right. That wasn't directorate language. They used words like aberrant or unclassified. Anomalous was a word used by scientists staring at something that broke the known rules of science. Jorin's blood ran cold. What is it? Brecker was at his side in 2 long strides, his usual gruffness replaced by raw concern. Gisela slid from her perch, her cybernetic eye whirring audibly as it focused on the small screen. "Well, well," she whispered, a flicker of morbid fascination in her organic eye. "Looks like the upgrade is rolling out a new feature." "I need a bigger screen," Jorin said, his voice tight. "Now, patch my datapad to your main display." For a heartbeat, Gisela just looked at him, the data broker weighing the value of this moment. Then she gave a small, sharp nod. "Connection port Alpha 3. But this viewing is on the house. Professional curiosity." Jorin didn't waste time. He slotted his datapad into a grimy port beneath a vast, wall-mounted monitor, a salvaged bridge display from a pre-Cascade cargo hauler. His fingers were stiff as he typed the authorization codes. The huge screen flickered, erupting in a shower of digital snow, then resolved into a stark, high-definition image. The contrast with Gisela's chaotic haven was dizzying. The feed showed the inside of a sterile quarantine pod, all gleaming white polymer and polished steel, lit by unforgiving medical LEDs. Inside, on a standard-issue bed, lay a single patient, one of the refinery workers he'd ordered into isolation. A medtech stood on the other side of the thick, transparent wall, speaking into an intercom, his voice inaudible on the security feed. Jorin's mind raced, a frantic scramble to impose order on the unknown. Hypoxia, delayed reaction to the sedatives, neurochemical cascade. He searched for a familiar pathology, a foothold for his reason. "He looks calm," Brecker murmured, his brow furrowed. He was right. The worker, a man in his 40s with the telltale pallor of a career dampskin, was lying perfectly still. But it wasn't the stillness of sedation. It was a placid, unnerving tranquility. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, a faint, almost beatific smile on his lips.
Then it started. A subtle shimmer on the man's forearms, like heat haze off hot metal. But the room was climate-controlled. Jorin leaned closer to the monitor. It wasn't sweat. It was a soft, internal light, a pale, sickly green-blue glow pulsing just beneath the skin. On the feed, the medtech saw it too. He moved closer to the glass, his body language shifting from routine observation to sharp alarm. He pointed, his mouth forming words that were lost to the silence. And then, the anomaly. From the pores on the patient's hands and forearms, fine white threads began to extrude. They were delicate, like spun glass or frost crystals, growing with a visible, impossible speed. Jorin felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a biological process. It was a physical manifestation. It was an act of creation. The filaments reached out, wavering in the recycled air, not randomly, but with a terrifying, unified purpose. They touched the chrome-plated steel railing of the medical bed. Instantly, the metal reacted, not with rust, not with corrosion, but with a transformation.
Where the filaments made contact, a pale, chalky substance began to bloom, spreading across the steel like a time-lapse film of coral growth. It hardened, forming intricate, fractal patterns of a pearlescent white, killing the metal's sterile reflection. Jorin couldn't breathe. His entire worldview, the bedrock of his sanity, was fracturing under the weight of the image on the screen. This wasn't a disease spreading through a body. This was a body being used as a catalyst to rewrite inorganic matter. The medtech stumbled backward from the glass, his face a mask of pure terror. He slammed a red panic button on the wall beside him, his mouth open in a silent scream. Through it all, the man on the bed remained serene. He slowly lifted his head, not looking at the panicked technician, but down at his own hands. He watched, with detached curiosity, as the filaments grew thicker, weaving a cocoon of alien coral around the bed frame. He was not a victim. He was a conduit. Gisela moved next to him, her living eye wide, but her cybernetic one was narrowed in intense analysis. She wasn't just seeing horror, she was parsing data. "It's not random," she breathed. Jorin could feel the faint warmth radiating from her as she leaned in. "Look at the patterns it's making on the frame, the geometries." Jorin forced himself to look past the body horror, to see what she saw. She was right. The coral-like growth wasn't a chaotic bloom. It was forming lattices, spirals, and complex angles that echoed the strange, sigil-like carvings he had seen in the refinery. It was a language. The plague was speaking. His own face, reflected on the monitor, was superimposed over the mutating metal. The sickly bioluminescent glow from the screen illuminated his wide, terrified eyes. The deceptive anxiety of his argument with Gisela felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. This was the precipice. This was urgent. Absolute alarm. The disease he had come to cure was not just rewriting humanity. It was overwriting reality itself. The door slid shut behind them with the greasy sigh of poorly maintained pneumatics, cutting off the cacophony of the bellows. Here, inside, a different kind of noise reigned. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny, frantic heartbeats, the whir of scavenged server fans, the high-frequency whine of overloaded capacitors, the almost subliminal crackle of raw data flowing through exposed conduits that snaked across the floor and ceiling like metallic vines. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and hot dust, an acrid perfume layered over the arcology's foundational smells of rust and brine. Gisela's data haven was less a room and more a nest, a hoarder's paradise of forbidden technology. Stacks of pre-cascade processors blinked with lonely, impotent LEDs. A trio of mismatched monitors cast a flickering, ghostly light on her face, the glow reflecting in the complex, whirring lens of her cybernetic eye. The drive she'd given him felt cold and unnervingly smooth in Jorin's hand, a black sliver of defiance. Brecker stood by the door, a mountain of quiet menace. His augmented arm, silent and still, seemed to absorb the sickly green light from a patch of bioluminescent fungus growing in a corner, giving the polished chrome a nauseating sheen. He was a piece of the Arium's sterile order, dropped into this chaotic den of ungrounded secrets, and he looked profoundly out of place.
Jorin drew himself up, the fabric of his directorate-issue coat feeling stiff and formal in the humidity. He needed to reclaim the narrative, to place this encounter back into a box he understood. I appreciate the offer, he began, the word tasting like a lie. But I am operating under the direct authority of the Directorate. I can't integrate unverified black market intelligence into an active containment protocol. It's a procedural breach. He held out the drive. I can't accept this. Gisela didn't move to take it. She just watched him, her organic eye narrowed, her cybernetic one spinning through micro-calibrations. Then a sound cut through the hum of the machines, a short, sharp, utterly mirthless bark of a laugh. "Ha! Procedural breach," she repeated, the word dripping with a contempt so pure it was almost impressive. "Oh, you can't compromise the integrity of the investigation. Is that it?" She leaned forward, her stool groaning in protest. The light from the monitors carved deep shadows under her cheekbones. "Theologian, let me tell you about the integrity of your investigation. It's a ghost, a bedtime story your bosses tell you to help you sleep in the damp." Jorin's jaw tightened. The anger was a familiar reflex, a shield. "The situation at the refinery is a result of a complex neurotoxin. My task is to manage the resultant mass hysteria and identify the belief structures it has latched onto. It is a mental hygiene crisis." He was reciting it now, the words a catechism of rational order against the impossible things he'd just seen. The coral growing from flesh, the metal screaming as it fused with bone. "Neurotoxin," Gisela said, her voice flat. She wasn't arguing, she was delivering a verdict. "They're really still using that one. Rust rot, that's just insulting. It's a lie so thin you can see the storm-racked sky right through it." She gestured vaguely upwards, towards the kilometers of metal and concrete that separated them from the surface. "They might as well tell you it was caused by metal hum madness or bad nutrient paste." Jorin's pulse hammered in his ears. He felt Brecker shift behind him, a subtle change in weight that spoke volumes. He's listening, Jorin thought. Every word.
The Directorate has the best analytic resources in Haven, Jorin countered, his voice strained. Their assessment is the only one that matters. Wrong, Gisela snapped, her gaze hardening. Their assessment is a cover story. It always has been. This isn't a leak from some kelp processing vat. It isn't a new phenomenon. It is old. That word, old, hung in the air, heavy and diseased. It felt more dangerous than anything else she had said. The things in the refinery hadn't felt new. They felt ancient, primordial. "You are a forensic theologian," she continued, her voice lowering, becoming more intimate, more venomous. "You dissect belief. You trace the mimetics. So trace this one. Trace the lie. Who benefits from you running around the bellows, chasing a neurotoxin ghost, while the real problem festers?" Jorin said nothing. The whirring of the fans seemed to grow louder, filling his head. "You're a tool, Vask, a very sharp, very specialized scalpel sent to cut away a symptom so no one ever thinks to look for the disease. And the disease isn't faith. It isn't hysteria." She leaned back, and her gaze shifted, moving past Jorin to land squarely on Brecker. Her cybernetic eyes zoomed in with a faint, audible click. She didn't look at Brecker's face. She looked lower, at the left shoulder of his body armor, at the small, stylized emblem stamped into the polymer plating, the twin waves and central drill of the Hydrocorpus logo. "Your bosses," she said, her voice now a low whisper,
but it carried across the small room with perfect chilling clarity. The ones who sign your paychecks in kilocals and keep the lights on, they know. They've known for 72 years, since the day they sank the first caisson for this rust bucket paradise. The silence that followed was absolute. The machine hum, the dripping water, the city's deep groan, it all vanished. There was only the three of them, locked in a triangle of accusation, loyalty, and dawning horror. Jorin could feel Brecker's stillness behind him. It was no longer the calm presence of a bodyguard. It was the rigid quiet of a man who had just been implicated in something he didn't understand. Jorin's defensive anger evaporated, leaving a cold, hollow space in his chest. His entire operational framework rested on the integrity of the Directorate, and by extension, the corporate state of Hydrocorpus that underwrote its existence. They were the architects of structured survivalism, the purveyors of logic, the bulwark against the chaos that had drowned the world. And this woman, this scavenger of data living in a nest of wires, had just claimed they were the authors of the single greatest lie in Haven's history. He looked down at the data drive in his hand. It was no longer a piece of black market contraband. It was a choice, a door to a room he was ordered to never enter. The neurotoxin story was a lie. He knew it. He'd known it the moment he saw the glowing coral erupt from that worker's arm, a biological transmutation that defied every known law. He had simply refused to accept the implication that he, Jorin Vask, the debunker of gods, was a pawn in a game he wasn't even aware he was playing. Slowly, his fingers tightened around the drive. He didn't hand it back. He slid it into the pocket of his coat. Gisela gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of grim satisfaction in her organic eye. "What did they do?" Jorin asked, his own voice sounding distant and unfamiliar. "They found something in the deep brine, in the foundations, and instead of telling people what it was, they built a city on top of it, and they hoped everyone would forget it was there." The air in Gisela Rosk's data haven was thick enough to drink. It carried the scent of ozone from overworked processors, the bitter tang of fungal spores cultivated in a grimy terrarium, and beneath it all, the ever-present smell of wet rust. Jorin felt it coat his tongue. Wires thick as constrictor snakes drooped from the ceiling, their insulation cracked and repaired with strips of gleaming polymer tape. They snaked down to a central console where Gisela sat, a spider in a web of flickering, mismatched monitors. Jorin wasn't sitting. He stood behind her, his arms crossed tight against his chest, a futile gesture of self-containment. His gaze was locked on the largest screen, which replayed the security feed from the refinery. The loop was short, mercifully short. It showed the worker, the thing it had become, lunging. It showed Brecker's augmented arm, a blur of chrome and hydraulic force. It showed the aftermath. He'd watched it 17 times. He wasn't watching the violence anymore. His focus had narrowed, his forensic theologian's mind desperately seeking a pattern in the chaos, a logic to the biological blasphemy. He was fixated on the victim's body in the seconds before the final lunge, on the skin. Veins of sickly green-blue light pulsed under the worker's flesh. They weren't random flashes. They were rhythmic. A slow, steady, hypnotic beat, a lighthouse pulse in a storm of flesh. It was the same pattern he'd seen in the grand, grotesque shrine the others had become. the one still growing in the heart of the refinery, fused to the very pipes and catwalks. "The light," Jorin said, his voice a dry rasp. It was the first thing he'd said in 10 minutes. "It's not erratic, it's a cadence." Gisela didn't turn. Her cybernetic eye, a disk of cold blue light, whirred softly as it tracked data across a secondary screen. Her organic eye remained fixed on the main feed. "Everything's a cadence if you look long enough, Theologian. Heartbeats, dripping water, the slow decay of this whole rust-bucket arcology. No, this is different." He leaned forward, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. The gesture felt weak, accusatory. "It's specific. Look. 1, 1, 2. A brief pause. Then again. 1, 1, 2. He was counting, trying to impose the familiar syntax of ritual analysis onto this alien biology. It was all he had left. His entire framework of faith as a cognitive disorder, of belief as a mappable pathology, had been shattered against the impossible reality of coral growing from human bone. All he could do now was describe the shape of the abyss. Gisela tilted her head. Her fingers, stained with ink and solder, danced across a touch-sensitive plate, greasy with fingerprints. A rhythm, a signal maybe. She dragged a selection box over the video of the worker. If it's sending a signal visually, maybe it's sending one audibly too. With a flick of her wrist, she brought an audio workstation to the main screen. A flat line spiked into a chaotic mountain range of reds and yellows. The worker's shriek, a sound that scraped the inside of Jorin's skull, a mix of animal panic and shearing metal, blasted from the speakers for a half-second before she muted it. "Rust rot," she muttered, tapping her temple. "Signal bleed from that thing's scream will give me a headache for a week." She began to work. Her movements were precise, economical. She isolated the few seconds of audio before the attack. All that came through was the ragged, wet sound of the workers' breathing and the distant, ambient noise of the refinery. "There's nothing there but lung rot and resonance," Jorin said, his hope for a clue souring into disappointment. "Resonance is the interesting part," Gisela replied, not looking up. She applied a series of digital filters. The waveform on the screen shifted, the higher frequencies peeling away like old paint. The wet rasp of breathing diminished, falling into the background. The directorate teaches you to find meaning in words, in symbols. I find it in the noise between the words, in the carrier wave, not the message. Another filter. The waveform flattened further, but something remained. A low, persistent oscillation. A sine wave, almost perfect, buried deep beneath the audible spectrum. "There," she whispered. She boosted the gain, amplifying the ghost in the machine. A sound filled the small room, a deep, resonant hum, a thrumming vibration that Jorin felt not in his ears, but in his bones, in the fillings in his teeth. It was the song of the city, the deep, groaning hum of the massive water purifiers, the vibration of the geothermal vent, the resonant frequency of 1,000,000 tons of steel under the immense pressure of the Atlantic. The locals in the bellows called it the metal hum. They complained of the madness it caused, the whispers it put in their heads. They had rituals, tapping sequences, little rhymes to ward it off, folk traditions Jorin had once dismissed as primitive superstition. He had been wrong, so catastrophically wrong. Gisela's expression was grim, but also morbidly triumphant. She was a purveyor of terrible truths, and business was good. An artifact of the recording? Maybe. Let's check. Her fingers flew again. She activated a live environmental microphone somewhere on her rig. A new waveform appeared on the screen, this one labeled Live Ambient. It was the sound of her own data haven, the drip of condensation down a bulkhead, the buzz of a failing capacitor, and underneath it all, that same pervasive hum. She overlaid the two waveforms, the one from the recording of the mutated worker and the one from the room he was standing in right now. They were identical, a perfect, chilling match, the peaks and troughs aligned with mathematical precision, the bioluminescent pulse on the worker's skin, 1, 1, 2, the cadence of the metal hum. The chanting sickness wasn't being spread by a person, by a patient zero like Kalis Rendor. It wasn't spreading through spores in the air or toxins in the water, not primarily. It was spreading through the city itself. The metal hum wasn't background noise. It was the carrier wave. The very structure of the arcology was the delivery mechanism, a tuning fork vibrating at the frequency of infection. Every person in Haven, from the dry feet in the arium to the damp skins in the bellows, was marinating in it, listening to its song every second of every day. Jorin stared at his own reflection in the dark screen. The harsh LED light carved deep shadows under his eyes. The face that stared back was not that of a forensic theologian, a detached scientist, a confident hunter of pathogens. It was the face of a man who had just peered over the edge of his perfectly rational world and found it was resting on the back of an impossible, singing monster. A man who realized he hadn't been hunting a virus, he had been living inside of it.